assembled.
But in this area, it would have been about every 3 to 5 years?
That's what this kind of research is saying.
Okay.
I suspect that it was actually more frequent than that. I think because some fires don't scar trees if it's a low intensity fire. And so this kind of science maybe underestimates the frequency of the fire.
Okay.
When you look at the historic accounts, when settlers were journeying across Iowa and they were writing in their journals, and where we've accessed some of those journals, they indicate that the indigenous people, the Native Americans, were burning every year in the fall. They would just light everything in the fall.
Wow.
And certainly not everything would burn, but much of it would burn. And so we suspect that 3 to 5 years might be even less frequent than it actually was.
Okay.
Hard to tell for sure. So today in the Less Hills, we have a system that's really out of whack, because since the Euro-American settlers settled in this area, and they had a lifestyle much like ours, which is very sedentary. We build a permanent house, and we erect fences for our livestock, and we plow up fields for our crops, and we construct roads, which are a barrier to the spread of fire. And so since we live in that manner, fire in our landscape is not as welcome as it was with the Native Americans, because they would just pick up and move on. And they were using fire very extensively. They used it for warfare, they used it for agriculture, they used it for hunting, they used it. You were talking earlier about how that tall grass prairie could be 6 to 8 feet tall, and imagine trying to walk through that. And if you were traveling a long distance, working your way through that, oftentimes it was easier to just light it on fire and then wait a few weeks for it to start to green up and then walk through that. So now the grass is this tall instead of 6 feet tall. So they used fire for various reasons.
Did you guys get that? Ag? What else? Ag, and for traveling purposes, and for
hunting,
and for warfare.
warfare.
Okay, so that's a lot of different uses for fire, where they just naturally used it.
Yep. They recognized that after it burned, it started growing, and it was very nutritious growth, and so the bison were attracted to that. The bison would come graze on that area that had recently been burned, and that was a way of kind of bringing the bison to them instead of having to go find them. So today we have a very different system. The image on the left shows the encroachment of the woody vegetation. The prairies are shrinking at a rate of about 2% a year, because the trees just continue to take over and shade everything out. With frequent fire in this system, the trees can't take over. Fire top kills the trees. They resprout from their roots, but it kind of keeps the trees where they're supposed to be, and it stimulates the grasses, it stimulates the wildflowers, makes all of those things grow more vigorously, makes the flowers flower more, which means there's more pollen for the insects, and there's more seeds for the insects and for the birds and everything that needs those. So that fire is an important part of the system. For everything from the plants to the insects to the bison and today cattle. The image on the lower right gives you kind of an idea of what savanna looks like. See those big open grown trees, and then there's grass underneath, so very scattered trees, not real dense with them. So today, fire doesn't just range across the landscape in a natural manner anymore for various reasons. And in conservation, we utilize fire because we recognize that it's important for the system, and so we actually intentionally light fires. Some people will call them controlled burns, and from experience I know that that's not a very good term, because you never really control a fire. We do everything that we can to keep it contained, and controlled burns are good. People when they're doing a controlled burn, they have good intentions and they mean well. But what we prefer to talk about is a term called prescribed fire. And prescribed fire is, you've heard of a prescription that a doctor makes, right? A doctor, when they're dealing with a sick patient, they may provide a prescription, and that prescription may be drugs, or it may be exercise, or it may be a change in diet or something like that, but they prescribe some kind of a treatment to help that person get well. That's what we're trying to do with a landscape that's not very healthy. It's not very healthy because we haven't had fire for a long time. And so in many cases we prescribe fire. And when we do prescribe fire, we prescribe the type of weather conditions that we need and the type of fuel conditions that we need to accomplish a safe and effective fire. So those are really important things, and that's what differentiates this from just controlled burning. Controlled burning means I'm going to go out and I'm going to burn today because it's a nice day, and I'm going to try to keep it under control. Prescribed fire means we're going to try to accomplish something very specific, and there's just a lot more science involved. And this is just a list that shows some of the things that go into that. I'll go through all of them in just a little bit more detail. The first thing is we set the objectives, which basically means we're basically saying why we're burning and what we're trying to accomplish when we light that fire. Are we trying to stimulate the grass or the flowers? Are we trying to reduce the fuel load so that we reduce the threat of a wildfire? Are we trying to top kill the trees? Those are examples of different objectives that we might have. And then we have the prescription parameters, which means what weather conditions and what fuel conditions do we need to do a good fire. And this is just an example of the weather prescription. So we say, okay, we want a temperature between 50 and 80 degrees. We want a relative humidity of 35 to 55%. And in this case, maybe we want the wind to be out of the southeast or the south or the southwest. In other words, we go through all of these different parameters and specify what we're looking for. And if on a given day we don't have those weather conditions, then we don't burn that particular area because it doesn't meet our prescription. We define what the burn unit is, or what is the area that we're going to burn. We have to describe it, identify where it's located. We provide a map that shows the area that we're going to burn and all of the things that we need to consider. And then we prescribe the resources. We list the resources that we need in order to help keep that fire contained. And resources includes the equipment and the people and all of that. We identify an action plan that roughly describes what we will do to keep that fire contained. And it's important, the plan that we're developing here is going to be an important record for people in the future to reference when they're trying to burn that same area again once we're gone. We also lay out a contingency plan, which is basically a what if. So what if something bad happens? What if one of our firefighters gets burned or has a heart attack or rolls an ankle or gets injured in some way? What if our equipment breaks down? How are we going to respond? What if the fire gets out of control? How are we going to respond? All of that goes into the contingency plan. In many cases, we also have a smoke management plan, which just outlines how we're going to deal with the smoke. And quite honestly, much of the time when we're burning, this is a bigger issue than that fire is. It's really relatively easy to keep the fire contained. The smoke is a lot harder to control, and the smoke has the potential to impact a lot more people than the fire does. So smoke management is a really big issue. And then we list all of the notifications, so the neighbors that need to be notified, the 911 center, the fire department, law enforcement.
We'll get a whole bunch of calls saying, there's fire!
Exactly.
Yeah, we know.
We want them to know what's going on. And then we outline our communications. How are we going to talk to each other? How are the firefighters going to talk to each other on the fire? We typically use two-way radios, and so we'll identify the frequencies that we're using, the frequencies that we need to talk to law enforcement, or if we need to talk to fire or medical and rescue. And then we have a list of phone numbers that are helpful to have. Then there's a checklist that we use. It's called a go, no-go checklist. And this is kind of the last thing that we go through, and we work down through this list and check things off if they're all good to go, if they're all ready. And if they're not, then we don't burn. But if they're all in place and ready to go, then we can burn. So that's kind of what goes into the planning. Now, we're engaged in the Less Hills. We're trying to get fire back on the landscape because it was very common here historically, and now it's not a healthy system because it's not been here for so long. The woodlands are very dense, they're overcrowded, and so we need to put fire back in the landscape to stimulate those plants and help things heal. And in order to do that, we need people to understand what we're doing. So we've put together a prescribed fire initiative. We're trying to increase the understanding of fire by doing a lot of fire education. We're also trying to expand the capacity of organizations to burn. The conservation organizations, the volunteer fire departments, and landowners. Because we would like to see people utilizing prescribed fire, but many people don't have the equipment or the ability to do that. And so we're working on that. And the overall goal that we're trying to do is increase the number of acres that are burning every year in the Less Hills to a healthier level. So some of the examples of the fire use education that we're doing, we do landowner fire ecology workshops where we teach landowners about fire ecology and how to do prescribed burns. S130, S190 is a basic wildland firefighter training that anybody that's going to go out west and fight fires, fight wildfires needs to have.
I think Mr. Greg talked about that, going through that training for anybody that's going to be involved in the firefighting. Now, you participated, right?
In this training?
Yeah.
Yeah. We are teaching this.
Oh, you're teaching it now?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Anybody that does wildland fire has to have this, and it's a basic beginning firefighter training. I mean, there's a lot of additional training beyond that.
Okay.
But we're teaching it to people here in the area because even though many of them won't go out west and fight big wildfires, because it's a national standardized training that gives everybody a common vocabulary and a common foundation to work from. And so we're teaching this to volunteer firefighters and to landowners and to conservation personnel and whomever's interested.
So then do you oversee then their prescribed fires, or
No.
do they
Some of them will come work with us on our prescribed fires.
Oh, okay.
And that
get the experience?
Yes, exactly. We require anybody that's working with us to have this training.
Okay.
And the Nature Conservancy requires that across the country. The National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
How young do they train?
18 years old and older.
Okay.
Yep.
So you're going to have to wait a couple of years.
That's right.
But that's pretty cool to learn that this is happening.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, do you work a lot with across the river to Nebraska at all, or?
A little bit.
Okay.
I studied over at UNO for a little while, and they're doing a lot of prescribed fire on a few areas that the university owns, and so we've helped them out. The National Park Service has their regional office
they're
in Omaha,
right.
And we work with them. Occasionally we work with the staff from DeSoto National Wildlife Refuge.
Okay.
So it turns out that there are about 10,000 wildland firefighters in the country. And that's overall, that's a pretty small
write
number.
that down, 10,000.
And it's a small world. We get to know each other.
Okay.
And it's kind of fun. I mean, we'll go out and fight fire out west and work in a camp where there's 1,000 firefighters.
10,000 wild firefighters.
And you run into people who know people that you know, and it's just kind of fun.
Cool.
These are some of the examples of the training that some of our folks go through. The basic training is the S130, S190 that like we talked about, but then if somebody, at the bottom of the page is squad boss. If somebody wants to be in charge of leading a group of 4 or 5 firefighters, they have to have that S130, S190, but they also have to have the S290 and the S131. And then if somebody wants to be in charge of leading the burn, the whole prescribed fire, there's a lot more training that goes into that. This is a Harrison County product in the upper right-hand photo right there. That's Cody Wohlers.
Oh, yeah.
He works with us. He's a really good fireman. And then the lower right photo is at an engine academy down in Florida. So we go out of state for training, and we go out of state for fire suppression assignments to work on wildfires, which turns out to be a really good training too. Great experience. And that's why we do it. So we learn an awful lot. The photo of Cody that's out in western Nebraska. He was working on a training exchange out there.
Yeah, but who knew that our conservation folks are trained firefighters? I mean, we don't never think of that.